turbo engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
Questions. Research.
technology. Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to The Naked Scientists podcast, the show that brings you the biggest breakthroughs and talks to the major movers and shakers in the worlds of science, technology and medicine. I'm Chris Smith, and today, Hantavirus aboard the MV Hondius. We're exploring how the outbreak of this viral disease could have occurred on this cruise, what happens to the people who've been affected, and how the international community is responding. On the 1st of April, the MV Hondius cruise ship set sail from Argentina. Just over a week later, one passenger suddenly became ill and died. At the time, natural causes were suspected, but in the days following, more people fell ill, including some who'd already disembarked and were en route home internationally. At this point, it was recognised that the cause was an unusual and thankfully relatively rare disease with a high mortality rate called Hantavirus. And specifically, it was a form of hantavirus called the Andes virus, specific to the Americas and usually carried by rodents. So far, of the roughly 150 people who set sail from Argentina, at least 9 have since been confirmed with the infection, and 2 more symptomatic individuals are suspected of having contracted the virus. We'll hear shortly how the international community, guided by the World Health Organization, are managing the situation and what risk is posed from exposed travellers who've been returning to their home countries. But first, let's hear about the cause of the problem itself, the hantavirus. Here's Colin Crump, who's a virologist and a fellow of Robinson College in Cambridge.
hantaviruses are RNA viruses, so they have a genome of a single-stranded RNA, and actually their genome is made up of 3 different segments, so it's a segmented virus, a little bit like influenza. Very small, they're about 100, 120 nanometers in diameter.
That's about 1/10,000th of a millimetre, isn't it?
That's correct, yes. They live naturally in rodents and generally are thought to not cause any disease in their normal hosts, but they can spread sometimes into humans and other species and cause disease.
Where are they found?
They're found throughout the world, so there's a lot of hantaviruses spread throughout Europe and Asia and Africa, and then there's also some other ones in the Americas. They tend to be classed as New World and Old World, so the New World are the ones found in the Americas, and the Old World are the ones found in Asia and Europe.
When we say hantavirus, it sounds like one single thing, but from what you're saying, it's a suite of viruses.
Yeah, it's a whole family of viruses. So the original name of the virus family comes from the first one that was isolated in Korea back in the 70s near a river called the Hantan River, hence the name hantavirus. But within that family, there's maybe 60 or more different viruses spread across the world, and there's plenty more to find.
And how many of those jump into us?
Off the top of my head, maybe half a dozen or more that we know of that can cause disease at least. So there may be many that jump into humans that don't cause disease that we don't know of. But there are certainly a few well-known ones that do cause disease in humans. There's the Hantan virus I mentioned, and Sol virus, which can cause disease in around Asia and China. There's also a few in sort of Europe. There's Pumala virus, and there's Dobrava virus. And then also in North America, there's Sinombre virus, and there's Andes virus, which you may have heard of in the news.
Now, when you say they live in rodents, they don't make the rodents ill because the virus has evolved to live with the rodent has evolved to live with the virus, so they're better bedfellows.
Yeah, that's the general consensus. So these viruses are natural sort of infection in the rodents, and they've evolved over the millennia to be in sort of a reasonable balance so that viruses don't tend to evolve to kill their own natural hosts. So they tend to more cause disease when they get into unnatural hosts that they don't normally live in.
And that's where we come in.
Exactly, yes. So when they do spread, and this is quite rare, fortunately, when they do spread into humans, they can cause some quite severe disease. And there's 2 main types, generally associated with the Old World and New World hantaviruses. So the Old World ones tend to cause more of a sort of renal disease, as well as a hemorrhagic fever type disease, whereas the New World ones tend to be more associated with cardio and pulmonary complications.
Do they mutate? Because when we had the COVID pandemic, that was a coronavirus, obviously a very different virus entirely. But we noticed that it was changing, it was evolving, and people became very familiar with people talking about this variant and high risk and lower risk variants. Do these ones do the same?
From what we understand at the moment, not a lot, no. I think because they live naturally in the rodent host, there's no sort of pressure for them to change. If they were to sort of continue spreading in the non-natural host like humans, then there may be more pressure to evolve. But fortunately, the transmission from human to human is very, very rare and only happens for like one or maybe two viruses that we know of.
A lot's been made of that, hasn't it? Where people have said and made reassuring noises. These viruses don't spread efficiently in people. It seems a bit paradoxical that something can be bad enough to kill you, but not infect another person from you, by and large.
It all depends on how it spreads and where it's released from and how much is released. So from what we know with these viruses, it's quite difficult for them to transmit from the natural reservoir, the rodents, to humans. It tends to be associated with exposure to mouse urine and feces and dust that's caused from there when sort of working in the field or working in the environment where clearing up sort of mouse droppings and things like that tend to be associated with disease and contraction. And there's very limited evidence of it ever transmitting from human to human. So maybe there's just not excretion into the fluids of the human, which is enough to get into another human unless you've got really, really close contact. They don't cause you to sneeze or cough that can spread the virus further.
But a case is being made that this Andes variant, which is the South American form at the heart of this present outbreak centred on the cruise ship, people are arguing that that one does have a track record of spreading between people. So what would be different about it that would enable it to do that then?
As far as I understand, that's the only real hantavirus that has shown some evidence of spread from human to human. Very small localized events like, 15, 30 people in a few outbreaks in South America. It's probably down to, again, to the biology of the virus or how it replicates when it gets into the human. If it replicates just that little bit more or can excrete just a little bit more into bodily fluids, then it's got a slightly more chance of spreading to somebody else if there's enough close contact.
Do you think there's a risk? Because we're thinking of it as a one-way street, that rodents have this, they give it to us, we might occasionally give it to each other. But say there's a population of rats or mice on the ship at the centre of this, and there's now a virus on the boat that does appear to spread between people. Could the people give their virus back to the mice and rats on the boat? And then we end up with a kind of a new zoonosis, which is actually quite good at spreading among people and is being carried by that population.
I guess in theory anything's possible, but that seems very unlikely. You'd think there would need to be very close contact between the human and the rodents for that transmission to go back again. So that seems not to be a likely scenario.
Treatments? What can we do about it? When someone catches these things, are there any drugs? Are there any molecules? Is anyone looking at that? Do we have any vaccines that might be useful against these things in the future?
There's not a lot. There has been a couple of vaccines made in China for the viruses that circulate there, so the Hantavirus and Solvirus, and are showing perhaps some promise, but I think it's early days. In terms of antiviral drugs, there's nothing really out there specific. I think there's been a few tests with some general RNA virus inhibitors like ribavirin. The evidence I was seeing, they slightly lessen the disease symptoms if they're given really early, but beyond the first few days, they have no effect. So there's not really much out there. I think at the moment, most of it is just about sort of fluid care management and the clinical setting.
Colin Crump at Robinson College, Cambridge. So let's explore the clinical impact of hantavirus infection in a bit more detail now. If someone's unlucky enough to become infected, which we think most likely happens when a person breathes in viral particles shed into the environment by rodent carriers of the disease, or, as we're learning with this present outbreak, potentially through close contact with an infectious human, they develop a systemic infection, which can affect a number of different organs. So what happens to them? Why? And how are they diagnosed and treated? As people are being returned home, provision for care is being organised in specialist isolation units. Most countries have a number of these, and they're set up to allow healthcare workers to look after patients while minimising the risk of an infectious agent being able to spread. Some US patients who have tested positive for the hantavirus are being monitored by authorities in Georgia, where experts at Emory University, Atlanta, are part of the response team. Bahuma Tatanji is an infectious diseases physician at Emory, and she's among them, and I've been speaking with her about how the virus causes disease and what they can do about it.
One of the things that has been very well characterized, particularly in the case of the strains of hantavirus found in the Americas, is that the virus has the ability to really affect the lining of blood vessels called the endothelial lining. And what it does is that it renders this cellular lining of the blood vessels leaky. You then have fluid that could potentially leak into the lungs, leading to what we call a cardiopulmonary syndrome in the most extreme cases. So that is why you probably have heard described that individuals may have difficulty with breathing, requiring advanced respiratory support from mechanical ventilation all the way to something we call extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, which is just a system that allows the blood to be oxygenated outside the body and provide the highest level of support while someone is not able to use their own lungs for that oxygen exchange. The good thing, though, is that this acute and very severe phase, which is what causes lethal infection in a lot of cases of the severe infection, only lasts about 2 to 4 days. And if you're able to provide that very high level of intensive care unit support, most individuals would go on to recover because that endothelial lining also repairs itself relatively quickly once this acute phase has passed.
Do patients get any warning? Do they feel off colour for a period of time before those very dramatic respiratory and cardiopulmonary effects kick in?
Yes, something we call the prodromal phase can last up to 2 to 7 days and precedes this acute crash into the cardiopulmonary symptom. And that particular prodrome is characterized by very nonspecific symptoms that you could get with any other viral infection, such as fever, severe muscle aches, a headache. Chills have been described, as well as gastrointestinal syndromes or symptoms going from nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain, and also just a general sense of fatigue. And this can be deceptive because some people may just assume that they have another viral infection that's going to quickly resolve. But then ultimately, after that phase, if they progress to the more severe form with this cardiopulmonary syndrome, this can happen pretty quickly, which is why when someone has a known exposure and you're worried that they have the potential to have an Andes virus infection, when they're in that prodromal phase, it's very important to be able to test and confirm if that is indeed what is causing their symptoms, and also have them in a facility that is capable of providing a high level of respiratory support and care should they progress to the more severe form.
And what's the nature of that testing? How do you confirm a person with that constellation of symptoms and the right history of contact has or hasn't got hantavirus?
Testing for the virus in the patient's blood, or you could also collect swabs from the respiratory tract. Additionally, besides these PCR testing, there are also ELISA tests that exist to test for antibodies, but these tend to be positive a little bit later than the PCR. So you can test for early antibodies that will appear in the acute phase of illness, known as IgM antibodies, and these tend to be positive about a week into that whole prodromal phase that I was describing, and could also help guide in making a diagnosis.
Are there any drugs that can be used to help turn the corner, or is a person entirely on their own? They've obviously given supportive management, but it's down to their own immune system to try and sort this out.
Unfortunately, there are no antiviral drugs that have been shown to be effective against the Andes strain of hantaviruses. And so we do not have any antiviral treatments that we can offer these individuals. The treatment really relies on what we call supportive care, which in the case of patients who are presenting with very severe pulmonary symptoms constitutes of ensuring that we're providing ventilatory support. If they have low blood pressure, we're providing vasopressor support to ensure that they don't go into shock. And we are also just providing general support for all their body systems to function properly and support them through that phase of acute illness until they get to the point of recovery.
The incubation period is quite long, isn't it? In some cases, it's been documented to be 2 months. So the current guidance, the World Health Organization and other policymakers in different countries are adopting a sort of stance of 6 weeks of waiting after a person's last contact in the present outbreak. So what will happen to those people? They're being repatriated to their home countries. Some are coming here to the UK. I know you've got some coming to your neighbourhood in the US. What's going to happen to those patients? Are they going to be locked up or kept at home? How will they be managed?
For now, most countries are having the approach that individuals who qualify as high risk, who were in close contact with a probable or confirmed case, will be taken to facilities where they can be monitored for clinical symptoms, tested, and potentially also confined and quarantined throughout that period where they remain at a high risk for developing symptoms up to 6 weeks from their last contact or exposure contact. Now, in terms of the individuals who are in the lower tier of exposure, who don't have a very strong exposure history, I'm taking, for example, someone who may have been on a flight with an individual who was on the Hondias and flew on that flight but wasn't necessarily in close proximity with that individual, they will most likely just have to be passively monitored. This would involve monitoring themselves at home for symptoms, being connected to their health department and checking in regularly, and also notifying health authorities should they develop symptoms. So the monitoring really depends on where the risk of exposure is classified, whether it's a high risk exposure or low risk exposure. Because as you would imagine, if you try to contact trace and you end up with 1,000 people who qualify as contacts, it then becomes really unreasonable to imagine a situation where you're having to quarantine 1,000 people in terms of resources and just the practical logistics of making that operational. So we have to approach this in a manner that is guided by public health principles and logic, and also in a way that still keeps the public safe.
Emory University's Bahuma Titanji.
The Naked Scientists podcast is produced in association with Spitfire, cost-effective voice, internet and IP engineering services for UK businesses. Find out how Spitfire can empower your company at spitfire.co.uk.
Music in the programme is sponsored by Epidemic Sound, perfect music for audio and video productions.
This is the Naked Scientist podcast with me, Chris Smith, and this week we're taking a closer look at Hantavirus, including the outbreak on the MV Hondias and the response from the World Health Organization. Now, the World Health Organization have been emphatic that this is not the start of another pandemic, and the UN health body added that cases are most likely linked to a birdwatching trip in South America. That's how it all started, because it included visits to sites where a species of rat known to carry the disease is present. But what exactly is known about how this virus passes into humans in the first place? And what factors play a role in increasing the odds of this happening, including with other viruses jumping the species barrier? Amesh Adalja is from the Johns Hopkins University Centre for Health Security.
The biggest factor is a human coming into contact with that rodent. And it can happen in various different ways. It could be rodents are living in a shed that might be in somebody's backyard, living in someone's attic, and there's cleaning going on, and the rodent droppings aerosolize, and that person then develops exposure to hantavirus and then develops the symptoms later on. The other way that this can happen is that there are just more rodents around, and that could happen because of increasing rainfall patterns, for example, that increase the food supplies of rodents, which leads to a boom in their population. And I think that's interesting because that's something that goes back in old Navajo legends, that when there were bountiful seasons, hantavirus soon followed in the southwest of the United States.
That's hantaviruses, but can there be other viruses following the same sort of pattern? Presumably, if you've got these sorts of things happening, the same mechanism could drive the emergence of a whole raft of different infections.
Exactly, not just viruses, even bacteria. So you think about in the United States, we are endemic, or we have so much Lyme disease in certain parts of the country, and that's that same cycle. So if you have high rodent populations, there are more rodents for the ticks to feed on, and then those ticks are more likely to come into contact with humans. So yes, anything that changes kind of the balance of what the reservoir is, where the pathogen, where it normally resides, anything that changes that population dynamic so that people are more likely to come into contact with it, that's going to lead to more infections.
This is therefore a human-nature conflict issue, presumably.
It's a human-animal interface issue that leads to infectious diseases. And many of our infectious diseases, if you look back far enough, all originate from animal species.
So what sorts of factors are the big players then? You've mentioned that the weather and climate can do it. You've mentioned that the rodent population, which might lie downstream of us making a mess and attracting them with rubbish dumps as well. It might be our activity that's doing it. But what are the other big factors that will be big drivers or things we need to consider when looking mechanistically at why this sort of thing happens?
I think it has to do with what activities a human does, because you just don't always come into contact with these rodents in everyday life. So if you look at this outbreak that's occurred on the ship, the first patient was somebody who was bird watching and going to places like garbage dumps and places like that to look for birds. That activity, that human activity, what that person was doing had an increased risk. And that's not just for hantavirus, it's for any infectious diseases. So, for example, if someone likes to explore caves, that's a human factor that increases their risk of infectious diseases. So these things are always there. Those populations are going to be fluxing based on all kinds of different variables. But one thing we can control as humans is what we do. And when you're doing things that are sort of the tip of the spear, literally going into places where you're more likely to come into contact with these types of animals and their viruses and their bacteria, that's a major factor.
And therefore, the more of us there are, the more rolls of the dice for this to happen. The human population is going up, not down. It's up a third in the last couple of decades. So that must be increasing the odds of this sort of thing happening.
The more humans there are, the more rodents there are, the more opportunity for interaction there's going to be between the two species. But I would also argue the more humans there are, the more human brains there are, which means the more vaccines and drugs and diagnostic tests and understanding that we get as well.
Although we don't seem to be fast to learn, do we? Because if you look at these hantaviruses, for example, there are no drugs for those and no vaccines, but the risk is getting larger that this sort of thing is going to happen for the reasons you've been outlining.
Yes, I think that's one of the problems, that hantavirus has been neglected. It's been known since the 1950s during the Korean War, when the old world hantaviruses were first discovered. But the new world hantaviruses in North and South America, those have been known since at least the 1990s, but they're very small problems. And if they're a very small problem, that translates to a very small market, and it makes it very hard for companies to justify investments in vaccines or antivirals, although there are some that are in early stages, phase 1 trials for certain antivirals and certain vaccines. And in South Korea, where they have old world hantaviruses, there is a vaccine that's been available since around 1990. It's moderately efficient, but doesn't necessarily work against the new world hantaviruses like the one we're dealing with now.
You've mentioned populations, both of the host animals and also us, and the role of conflict, us against nature and coming into contact to drive these sorts of things. The other factor that we probably should touch on is mobility, because as a species we are more mobile than we've ever been. We're flying all over the place, going on boats, as this case highlights, and cars, planes, everything. So we're very, very mobile. That must also, that connectedness and high networking that brings must also presumably increase the odds of disease outbreaks and spread.
It's only in recent years, and in very recent years, that we've been able to travel far distances. Even in the 1800s, 1900s, a pathogen would travel at the speed of a steamship. So a person might get sick on a boat, but they wouldn't actually make it to their destination, or they would recover. So you didn't have importation of disease. But now pathogens travel at the speed of a jetliner. So you can literally be in one part of the world and farthest reach on the planet 24 hours later. And that's shorter than any incubation period. So you can bring anything anywhere. And I think travel and the speed of travel does accelerate the pace of outbreaks. And I think it's no surprise that we see this more and more as we get better and better at traveling the globe.
So it isn't a coincidence at all then that if we tot up how often this seems to be happening with the emergence of new things that are making headlines, that does appear to be intensifying.
Exactly. And I think the other thing that goes along with this is the rise of megacities. For most of human existence, humans lived in smaller settlements. When they started to live in places where there were other humans and animals, like domestic animals and agriculture, that increases that exposure to pathogens, and it creates enough population that what we would call crowd diseases, diseases that spread from a person to another person, have enough people to infect. So yes, I think as civilization has advanced, so has the risk of infectious diseases. But on the countervailing side of that, so has our innovation to be able to tame and master some of these issues.
Well, that didn't work too well for COVID. I'm sorry I had to say that, but it still shows we can get caught out, doesn't it?
And when you look at COVID, I think that's really about human decision-making errors, not a technological failure. Because if you think about how quickly they were able to make highly effective vaccines for COVID, home tests for COVID, monoclonal antibodies, antivirals. We made more countermeasures against COVID than we had for any other respiratory virus within the span of like 18 months. So in that way, COVID was a technological success, but you can't really account for the policymaking failures of our policymakers and the reactive stance that many countries took when they should have been proactive, jumping into action in January and February of 2020 rather than waiting till mid-March before they actually started to do things, but became too late.
Thought-provoking stuff. Amesh Adalja there at the Johns Hopkins University Centre for Health Security on the mechanisms at play behind the increasing rates of new disease emergence and what we need to do to reduce the risk of it happening in future. Regrettably, though, it does happen from time to time, and so finally today we're going to get the latest on the outbreak and how the World Health Organization is responding. Maria van Kerkhove is the head of the Emerging Diseases and Zoonosis Unit at the WHO.
First of all, I'm going to say thanks for having me on your show because I always love doing this show with you. It's been 10 days since we first became aware of what we now know are cases of hantavirus on this cruise ship. In the last 10 days, there has been a highly organized, choreographed outbreak investigation to understand who is infected, with incredible laboratory support from South Africa, from Dakar, from the Netherlands, from Switzerland. I mean, incredible, quick diagnostics and sequencing to track an unfolding cluster of hantaviruses associated with a cruise ship, which started in Argentina and moved up the coast of Africa. And over the course of these last 10 days, there have been 11 cases that have been identified. 9 of these are confirmed. 2 of them are probable. We've had, unfortunately, 3 deaths. We have had the ship dock in the Canary Islands with massive efforts from Spain, the Netherlands, and all of this coordinated by WHO of repatriated passengers and crew back to their home countries where active follow-up is taking place to monitor them for signs and symptoms, further laboratory testing, all in an effort to contain. And I think it's really important to stress that this is not a COVID situation. The story's not over, but a lot of actions have taken place to actually minimize the impact of hantavirus on this cruise ship.
Do we have a source yet?
Our current working hypothesis is that the first 2 cases, who were a couple who unfortunately died prior to them getting on the ship, they were in Argentina. And they had gone on some bird watching tours in Argentina and Chile, in Uruguay. And in these areas, there are rodents that carry hantavirus, that carry the Andes virus in particular. And our working hypothesis, because we know the incubation period can be quite long, up to 6 weeks, we think they were infected, one of them at least, certainly the first case, but perhaps both, off of the ship. And given that they boarded the ship in Argentina and they went on this cruise, there was potentially some human-to-human transmission, particularly to the ship's doctor, who is in isolation in the Netherlands, and I understand stable, which is good news, to another crew member who is a guide, and to some others. So we're really trying to better understand what happened on the ship in terms of what types of contacts actually resulted in transmission. But our working hypothesis is that it started prior to the ship's departure in Argentina on the 1st of April, and that over the course of the last month or so, there was some limited human-to-human transmission on the ship.
When do we think the infectivity period for a case is? In other words, when a person becomes a potential threat to someone else?
When they are symptomatic. However, there may be a 2-day period beforehand where there could be some transmission. But this is very, very different than COVID, like we've said before.
Given that window, how many people then are you currently considering as possible contact/incubatees that we need to follow up or at least have on a list?
So we are actively working with all of the countries that had nationalities on board and people who have come into contact with passengers when they were off the ship. So there's a detailed lists of individuals. Certainly our characterization of anyone on the ship, passengers and crew, we treat them as high-risk contacts, which means we are recommending a 42-day period of active follow-up and quarantine either in a dedicated facility or at home. And what we mean by active follow-up is daily checks of their health, that they're not in contact with other people, If anyone develops symptoms, they should be isolated immediately and medically cared for. So there are people that we are following, the passengers and crew on the ship. So that's the 147 that were there, the people that disembarked in St. Helena, the people who were on the flight, the medical attendants in South Africa. So it's not a huge number of people, but it is a concentrated list. And we do have excellent people in the countries that are following each of these people up.
And is this a tried and tested method, asking people to self-monitor at home as long as they stay asymptomatic? And obviously you escalate accordingly after that. Do we know that's a reliable and safe way to manage a situation like this?
We'd actually prefer more of an active follow-up, which can be done in person, it can be done by phone, but really to follow these individuals for that 42-day period, which has been decided that the last point of exposure was on May 10th. So that actually brings us up to June 21st, if I'm not mistaken. Certainly, people, if they are asymptomatic, can self-monitor. And I think in this situation, there's so much attention to it that they will oblige. But remember, not all countries are the same. If people are in self-quarantine or in quarantine in a facility, they need to be cared for. They need to be given food. They need to be given water. They need to be respected. We don't want people losing their jobs. We don't want any stigma associated with this. It's just really just trying to take a precautionary principled approach to limiting any further spread. But we rely on the medical authorities in all of these countries to actively monitor and follow up each of these individuals.
So there's no obligation on some of these individuals to actually comply?
We give our recommendations and we work with the countries to set the policies in the countries. And not every country is doing the same thing in terms of their follow-up.
One infectious diseases physician has suggested that there's a line in the sand of about May 19th, because based on the incubation period we've seen for the other cases so far, if we're going to get tertiary cases, so we've got the first person who gave it to these second people, if these second people have given it to anybody else, they ought to be manifesting by then. So if we don't see cases at that point, does that give us a lot more reassurance? Does that make us feel even more comfortable?
I think the numbers may fluctuate in the next couple of days. Certainly, even in the last 24 hours, people that have gone home, there will be serology that will be done. So I think the numbers will change a little bit. What I feel confident in is the management of all of these individuals and the active follow-up now. So I think if we do see additional cases, it doesn't mean that the situation is out of control. It just means that laboratory testing is underway. People will get medical care. We haven't had any more deaths. And while we have had 3 deaths that are tragic, we haven't had any further deaths among the confirmed cases or anywhere else. And I think that is a good sign. The people who are in ICU in the Netherlands and in South Africa, in Switzerland are doing well. So that to me is incredibly encouraging. But our work is not over. So we're working with the governments to make sure that we're getting regular feedback on all of the contacts. Anyone who develops symptoms needs to be immediately notified. And I think we should wait until, June to understand, the full extent of this. But I am confident in how everything has been managed. Can we guarantee? Of course not. But I am confident in how countries, how seriously they have taken this, their obligations, to care for the people involved and to make sure that they take all of the precautions to limit any potential further spread.
A very reassuring and measured message from Maria van Kerkhove, who's the Director of Emerging Diseases and Zoonosis at the World Health Organization. We will keep across this story, of course, as it continues to unfold, but as we've highlighted many times on this programme, and as Amesh alluded to earlier, the forces that are driving the emergence of new diseases, growing populations, urbanisation, degradation of the natural world, human-animal conflict and climate change, of course, are all intensifying. And it's not a coincidence that we're seeing more of this happening and with an increasing frequency. We therefore need to remain very much on our guard, and policymakers around the world need to ensure that scientists and healthcare workers internationally are equipped to conduct high-quality surveillance so we can keep tabs on threats before they creep up and bite us on the behind. Thank you very much to all of this week's contributors. We'll be back on Friday, of course, with the latest science news stories from the week, including the release of a tranche of UFO files by the Trump administration. What do they really reveal? We'll also have our usual updates on social media, and if you'd like to support our work, please head on over to nakedscientist.com/donate. Your donations help us with our running costs, and we really appreciate your support. That's nakedscientist.com/donate. I'm Chris Smith. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.